Hi, I'm Paranaz.
And I'm Jake, and we are heading SHP Connections this year in addition to Kate Brandon. And so the goal of this program is to give SHP students kind of insight into exciting career paths that they can start thinking about. Kind of in that strain, on March 23rd, we will be holding an all-school career day, during which students will be able to listen from guest speakers from all the way from venture capital to nonprofit, and also be given time to network with professionals from all around Silicon Valley and California. We will be assembling a student committee to help organize this event, so please see our email to apply for a position on this committee.
And in the months leading up to the Career Day, we'll be conducting interviews with professionals of interesting careers, which we'll send to you as emails in addition to posting them on the quad. Without further ado, please enjoy our interview with Sir Nick Clegg, former Deputy Prime Minister of the UK and current Vice President of Global Affairs at Facebook.
Hi everyone, this is the first interview of the SHP Connections program, sitting down with Mr. Nick Clegg, who has had a very interesting career, which he'll expand upon in a minute. First of all, thank you very much for
Thank you.
Not at all. It's great to do this.
Yeah, thank you. Really a pleasure to have you. So to kind of kick this off, could you kind of summarize your overall career path, just more of what you've done, so that everyone can kind of get a sense of where you've been.
So I'm British, as you can possibly hear from my accent. I'm 52, and in my early career, I did a bunch of different things. I jumped around a bit. I dabbled a bit in journalism. I worked as a consultant in London, and then I spent about 20 years in politics in Europe as a member of the European Parliament, and then for many years in the British Parliament as a member of Parliament. I eventually became Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 2010 to 2015. And now, obviously sitting in sunny, well, it's dark outside, but anyway, otherwise very sunny California, and I'm now a Vice President at Facebook for global policy and communication. So I oversee all of the company's policies on everything from anti-terrorism to data protection, and also how we communicate with the outside world. So I've switched from the public sector for most of my life to the private sector, the tech sector here in California.
In college, did you have any experiences that influenced your path forward? Did anything?
To be honest, I always envy people who kind of know from a really young age what they want to do and have a kind of clear map in their head. I never did. I had things that enthused me and interested me, and I think I was always interested in not so much party politics, but I was always interested in kind of political ideas and contemporary history. And I kind of, when I came from a kind of very chatty family where we'd always talk about sort of the news and stuff. But I really genuinely never thought that I would ever go into politics. I mean, I remember vividly looking at politicians back in the 1980s when I was at university I went to Cambridge University in the UK, and looking at politicians on the television and sort of thinking they were another species, and I just thought they came from another planet. And I was like everybody else. I was sort of shouting at the television because I disagreed with what. So the idea that I would be part of that species one day would, as a young man, would have filled me with horror. But and then I think what was very important to me, which was helpful, given that I didn't have, as I say, I didn't have a sort of preordained plan in my head, is I was very lucky because I came across a couple of people in my life, older people, in both cases actually, my bosses at different parts of my career, who became they weren't just my boss, they were my mentor and sort of friends. So there was a guy called Sir Leon Britton, who I worked for a few years as basically as a sort of civil official in Brussels in something called the European Commission. The details don't matter, but the point was he was incredibly generous with his advice about what I should do next with my life, and he could see I was very interested in politics. And he was actually the first person, I'll never forget it, who sort of said to me, look, instead of complaining about politics, why don't you put your own neck on the line and actually do it? And I remember I was kind of dumbfounded, and I was uncharacteristically stumped for words. And I thought, wow, is that something you can actually do? So he was the first person who said to me, do you know, don't believe that those avenues are closed off from you. And I think that's a really important. And then later in life, not that much later, there was a guy a guy called Lord Paddy Ashdown. Sadly, both have passed away since. And he was my sort of political mentor when I first started taking my first steps in politics. And he helped me enormously in kind of trying to find my feet. So I was very, very lucky in having two people who were of a different generation to me, but were very generous with their time and their advice and their support. And I've absolutely no doubt that I wouldn't have taken the steps that I did without their kind of encouragement.
Did they mentor you throughout college, or was this after when you?
No, it was afterwards, and it wasn't. See, mentoring now is quite a sort of formal thing, and people do, which is great. But and maybe it was different back then in the 80s here in the United States, but in the UK, I don't think the word mentoring ever crossed, our vocabulary. It just wasn't something people kind of thought about in an organised sense. No, I mean mentoring. It was much more spontaneous than that. I think what you're implying in your question is, with hindsight, I would have loved to have had someone who I could have asked those kind of questions about as a mentor when I was a student. This came later.
And so, you touched a little bit on your work, getting into your work in government, and there's a lot there to talk about. But what would you say to kids, thinking about careers in government? What should 15 to 18-year-old students know about public service?
Well, I think the truth is that elected politics, which is what I was involved in, is very, very different to public service. I was a public servant before I went into politics. I alluded earlier to working for Lyon Britain. I was again, the details don't matter, but for a short while I was a trade negotiator for the European Union, and I spent a lot of time, for instance, in China and Russia. I was a very junior part of the team, helping to negotiate China and Russia's entry into the World Trade Organization at the time. This was back in 93, I think 1993, 1994. So I think being a public servant, being part of the administration, is very different to actually sort of facing the voters. It really, they are utterly different. So I think it's important to decide which of those routes you want to take. If you're going to take a political route, politics is a brutal, brutal business. You really do need to have, the hide of a rhino. It's pretty brutal. It almost always ends up in disaster of some description. It's unstable. It's unpredictable. It's all-consuming. The pressures are immense on your family. So I think if you're going to take that route, I guess my simplest advice would be do other things first. I always strongly counsel people not to go straight into politics from college, because I think it's important to build up other experiences and other things that you can fall back on, because politics is a very unpredictable business. I think public service is a different matter, and of course that changes from country to country. In a big country like the United States, you've obviously got state level public service, and I think that's a great experience to have, local and state level, before aspiring to kind of federal or national public service. So that's where I would probably start if I was starting along that route.
Interesting. And public service is shifting, obviously, as globalization is occurring, and especially in the United States, UK as well, where there's a lot of these international agreements and things of that sort. A lot of jobs are opening up on kind of that global communication scale, and this kind of ties in with the work that you're doing now at Facebook with global affairs. So, what would you kind of say about where public service and you can explain into the private sector as well, is going with kind of this trend of globalization?
So that's a very, very good question. But as per my earlier response, I think there is no replacement from starting at from the ground level, even for a while, because if you very quickly kind of climb the greasy pole and you're working in big international organisations, the World Trade Organization I mentioned earlier, or the OECD, or the United Nations, or whatever. I think doing that without really having got got a bit of dirt under your fingernails first, I think you'll end up lacking judgment. And the thing that I have really found perhaps most rewarding looking back was the work that I did in my what you call district, what we call constituency in a pretty gritty northern city in the UK called Sheffield. And I represented that district for 12 years and was really immersed in the kind of local life there. And I think if you can, I think it's always worth doing work at the ground level. So I don't know, for the sake of argument, let's say if global education policy really interests you. There are lots of big global institutions, development organizations who do educational work in developing countries, or big think tanks doing big international work, or big university exchanges and so on. But I think spending time actually understanding how education works for kids, particularly for kids who don't have perhaps the advantages that we do living here, I think that's really important. And I think generally one can often find the opportunities to do that when you're younger, and they just become harder when you're later. So that's one thing I would say. Of course, the problem is, and this applies to big tech companies here in Silicon Valley just as much as it does to big automobile corporations, aerospace companies and so on, is that even though globalization is, as you say, having a huge impact on our lives, that's colliding with the fact that people also want to feel that they understand or are in control of their own lives, and that's why you get these huge tensions, and that's why you get a lot of anger towards globalization, anger towards big tech companies, anger towards big institutions which are far out of reach. And I think to understand that frustration and understand that anger that people have about things that are big and distant and kind of don't make sense to them, I think that's really important in this day and age.
Mm. All right, yeah, kind of bringing it back now to kind of more general career advice. If you could tell your high school self one thing about beginning whatever career trajectory it may be, what would you have said?
I think the main thing I would say is don't weigh yourself down with your own expectations. I mean, be ambitious, of course, be aspirational. All of that's true, but don't become a slave to your own ambitions. I mean, life is there to be enjoyed step by step, day by day, and it's good to look at the distant horizon. But if you fixate on it, you don't look at what's lovely, under your feet, if I can put it like that. And I do think I think the pressure on you guys is much greater than my generation, much greater, and everybody has to have a perfect plan, and everybody has to have it all mapped out, and everybody, and that's great. But I sometimes worry that it can just set up a lot of expectations that you're just bound sometimes not to meet, and because life is as much about accident as it is by predetermined design. So I kind of would say to myself, and I would probably say to folk now, is aim high, think big, but also kind of just relish each step on the journey without becoming over fixated about whether you get to the pot of gold at the end.
Mm-hmm. Because a lot of kids now, despite the pressures that are on them, kind of really are still very open to a bunch of different things.
Right.
Kind of like you were talking about with, thinking as a young man, like if, maybe private, public. What would you say to those students thinking now, like, oh wow, I don't really know what I want to do? Is there any advice?
Well, first, don't worry if you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you don't have to know. I mean, I think you were telling me earlier you'd love to go into medicine. That's wonderful. I think that's great. If you've got a passion to be a teacher or a medic or a lawyer or something, that's great. I didn't have that. It kind of now makes a little bit of sense with hindsight that I should end up in public life, because with hindsight I can slightly sort of join the dots and see why I might end up in that direction. But don't beat yourself up if you don't have the perfect answer. And particularly if you've got the ability to do it, trying stuff out is I don't think anyone really expects that in your late teens and early 20s you should have all the answers to the future. And very, very often I think people find their path through accident and serendipity just as much as anything else, because someone they meet, because of an internship they do, which suddenly lights a passion or an interest which they didn't previously have. So I think having an open mind is great, and I certainly don't think people should kind of beat themselves up for indecision. That's a pretty natural thing in life.
Before your work in politics, I don't know if you already touched on this, but were you involved in other internships, when you came out of college or even in high school?
I ended up doing an internship in Brussels at the European Union public administration there, called the European Commission, and I subsequently then worked full time for it, a couple of years later. So that clearly helped, because that gave me a taste for it. So I think if you can do these these short-term stints, I think it's just wonderful, because it gives you a kind of insight into the work. So that's definitely worth doing. But again, it's like the mentoring. It just seems to me it's much more organised now, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and yeah, so thank you very much for sitting down with us. I don't want to take too much of your time. Before we wrap up, are there any other kind of bits of advice or wisdom that you want to share?
No, I just think it's great that you've got all these opportunities. B, you've got all these systems, whether it's career fairs, mentoring, internships, to kind of make up your own mind and kind of enjoy the journey, because one day you'll be like me in your 50s and sort of think, oh look, isn't that interesting? I took that turn rather than that turn, and just enjoy it. I mean, just relish it. It's wonderful. It's the world's your oyster. Enjoy it.
Great. So thank you very much for watching, and a big thank you again to
Thank you.
Mr.
Thank you
Nick
so
Clegg.
much.
Yeah. All right.